Hello! Having recently discussed recurring aspects of Final Fantasy lore such as Biggs and Wedge, Gilgamesh, and the ever-evolving summons, today I'm taking a brief look at another of the recurring tropes and consistently reimagined characters that's present in the series. Like the aforementioned additions, the character of Cid has become a staple and expectation for Final Fantasy fans, and was initially conceived by Hironobu Sakaguchi as a consistent, albeit non-significant, inclusion to the games, as a cameo and often humorous reprieve from the dramatic world-saving storylines. That said, however, and despite the series creator himself stating that there's no real significance to Cid, I've always felt that his role and purpose in the games is emblematic of what the series thematically stands for and often delivers in terms of world and setting. And what I mean by this, and as I mentioned in my What is Final Fantasy episode, the games often hinge around a transition and juxtaposition between old and new and technology and nature. You know, whether it's the fusion of medieval knights and innovative steam technology in Final Fantasy IX, or the ruthless expansion of the technological Shinra Corporation at the expense of the natural world in VII, Final Fantasy worlds are always found to be in a state of flux and transition, and for me the universal character of Cid, who is almost always a mechanic, a machinist or inventor, is actually an avatar of this relentless push of technology, which each and every Final Fantasy world brings to bear, to some extent or another. So, whether it's a plot point such as the Machina-wielding Al-Bhed in contention with the more ascetic Church of Yevon, or merely a contributing incidental such as Baalam Garden being able to fly, every Final Fantasy game hinges around technology and modernisation, and Cid is usually the character that ushers the player's party into this through the gift of an airship or comparative advancement of transport. Aside from being a machinist and wizened elder, Cid also has the rarely noted trait of having a recurring female counterpart. Cid Haze has Mrs. Cid in Final Fantasy III, Cid Pollendina has his daughter in Final Fantasy IV, Cid Highwind has the long-suffering Shera in VII, Cid Kramer has Edea in VIII, the adulterous Regent Cid has Hilda in IX, Cid in X is Yuna's uncle, so she is the female counterpoint for him, and Cid in XV has his rather sparsely dressed granddaughter Cindy, all of which I'll touch on shortly, but suffice to say, it's interesting to see how Cid, as an often wise, empowered and headstrong man, tends to answer only to these women, certain women in respective games. So, working canonically through the games and excusing retcons, Final Fantasy II was the first instance in which we saw a Cid character introduced, and right from this initial debut, this prototypical Cid came complete with his recurring traits as a wizened elder who, having retired from knighthood, has opted to become an airship pilot who taxis characters across the realm. Being mortally wounded by the Empire's artificial cyclone, Cid then hands over the reins of his airship to Firion, and thus, right from the get-go in this first instalment that features him, we have these renowned tropes as the giver of transport, appearing. Cid Haze of Final Fantasy III, in similar fashion, hands the responsibility of an airship to the party after he is rescued from the Djinn on the island of Kazas, and in a subplot that always reminds me of the Lotus Eaters in Homer's Greek epic, the Odyssey, we first encounter Cid when we find him incapable of leaving an island because he's become a ghost, rather than forgetting the outside world like the Lotus Eaters. But he's become a ghost and we have to defeat the Djinn and help him escape from this. And Cid Haze is also the first rendition of a Cid to have a female counterpart, and a subsequent quest after we rescue him hinges around having to find and heal her with an elixir, which is the first inkling of significance offered to Cid having a significant other, and often how Cid characters prioritise the female in their life, over most other things. Cid Pollendina in Final Fantasy IV is interesting in an entirely different way from the remaining Cids, and this owes to the fact that for me, he looks almost identical to the sky pirate captain found in the Studio Ghibli film Porco Rosso. Now, if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that I started discussing the Ghibli films a while back, and it's something that I really need to complete at some point. But this innovative series of films is known to be an influence on Final Fantasy creators, and creatures such as the horseclaw birds from Nausicaa Valley of the Wind, for example, were inspiration for the chocobos that we see, all throughout the Final Fantasy games. So, back to Cid and Porco Rosso, this link is interesting because the film Porco Rosso is set during World War I, and the eponymous hero is a flying ace who, mans a red aircraft. Much like the real-life flying ace, Manfred von Richthofen, who was also known as the Red Baron. We have this link between red aircrafts, the Red Baron, and in Final Fantasy IV, we have Cid, who is an engineer for an air force known as the Red Wings, in the Kingdom of Baron. So, it may well just be a coincidence, it might be, but, they look visually identical, this Sky Pirate and Cid. And it's very interesting to consider that not only this visual similarity, but also how the Ghibli film and the game seem to be influenced by this particular facet of World War I aviation and the Red Baron. I've looked into it, and it's important to note that Final Fantasy IV was released exactly 1 year before Porco Rosso, so I'm not sure if one could have influenced the other, but I do find it quite an uncanny allusion there. So beyond this, Cid in Final Fantasy IV introduces the player to the Enterprise Airship, and this is the first Cid that's of an ongoing and quite consistent importance, with regards to story and events that unfold. And after being arrested for treason and saved by Cecil, he joins the party as a playable character. Moving on to Final Fantasy V, this Cid again furnishes us with airship technology, but most importantly we see the first instance where Cid's status as a modernizer and a machinist is to the detriment of the natural world. Cid and his grandson Mid harness crystal energy to fuel their inventions, and subsequently make Karnak one of the most powerful and prosperous kingdoms in the world. However, despite Cid realising the detriment this has on the crystal, and trying to prevent it, the crystal does eventually degrade and is destroyed alongside Karnak Castle, much to Cid's dismay. And this is similar to Final Fantasy VI, where we see Cid's character, a Magitech inventor, and he seems oblivious to the fact that, his inventions and his genius and his research is being utilised for increasingly ruthless aims by the Empire. And although Cid in Final Fantasy VI isn't a bad man per se, and purely has a love of science and research, his passivity towards the Empire's actions is somewhat questionable, and he does actually remind me somewhat of the real-life physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, who, despite being driven by a love of science and research, was an integral figure to the Manhattan Project and the development of the atom bomb, which he did, live to question and regret in his later years. So, Cid of Final Fantasy VI doesn't have a wife or a relative in this game, but he has a very close paternal relationship with Celis, which fits into this trope of a female counterpart, I think, which I mentioned earlier. But it's also prudent to note that Cid in 6 also doesn't provide us with our ultimate airship technology, which becomes the remit of Setzer and the Blackjack airship that he provides us with. Moving on to Final Fantasy VII, here we saw the ill-tempered Cid Highwind introduced as a jaded pilot, engineer and wannabe astronaut, who, thanks to his pedantic assistant Shera, has his dreams dashed at the last minute when he, tries launching his rocket program. And Cid is an interesting character in this game because he's not only playable, but he actually takes control of the party as a leader for a short period of time, which elevates his significance beyond most incarnations of Cid that we've seen before or since. His dubious relationship with Shera is also a source of comedy, tough love, or awkwardness, depending on how you consider this game, but it's interesting to note that sequel installments, particularly Dirge of Cerberus, show that Cid has not only named his new airship after her, but he has actually married Shera, which shows that his foul temper with everyone, from Shera to Cloud, does mask an obvious warmth and affection that he simply can't bring himself to show in person. Cid also gives us the tiny Bronco, which is probably one of the more useless vehicles that we acquire in any Final Fantasy game, as it immediately gets shot down and operates as a really poor form of water transport more than anything else. In Final Fantasy VIII, Headmaster Cid serves as a significant, affable, but also quite tragic figure through the game events. In stark contrast to Cid of Final Fantasy VII, Cid Kramer is an affectionate man who is seen openly weeping by Squall, at a certain point in the game. And he acts as a paternal and encouraging figure to Squall, quite early on, but is later seen to have further significance with the main story, as it's revealed that he is Adia's husband. And it turns out that despite his profound love for his wife Adia, he was strong-armed by her to establish the Garden Academies, which would one day have to face her down. So Cid's always actually been quite haunted by the fact that he could well be the catalyst to events that may well kill his wife. And regards to transport, he also directs us to the Balam Garden subfloors, which allows us to unlock the flying capability of the Garden Academy. So indirectly, once again, Cid is the provider of transport in this game. Final Fantasy IX sees Cid as a regent of Linderblum, and amusingly, he has made the mistake of committing adultery, and they say that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and in this instance his wife Hilda has turned him into an oglop, prompting a humorous side quest where we have to help him achieve human form once again, but accidentally end up turning him into a frog. As well as this, he does very briefly become a playable character at a certain point in the game, and once again continues the trend of being an inventor and an airship designer, and he furnishes us with various iterations of the steam and mist-powered Hildegard airships. In Final Fantasy X, Cid is an Al-Bhed leader, Yuna's uncle, and an obligatory grouch, such as we see in Final Fantasy VII and XV. As the leader of the Al-Bhed, Cid has a weighty responsibility to salvage and secure the future of his people, which is done primarily by unlocking the Fahrenheit airship after the destruction of the Al-Bhed stronghold. Rather than handing the airship capability over to the party, however, and owing to Final Fantasy X's linearity of gameplay, Cid and Brother are fixtures of the aircraft and can be interacted with, throughout the game to choose destinations. So, at this point, I'm going to skirt briefly over Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV, as I've mentioned before that my knowledge of the MMOs is actually quite limited, but I am aware that Cid characters do feature in both of these games as a facet of quests, storylines, and in both instances he resumes his role as an engineer and provision of transport and upgrades. Moving on to Final Fantasy XII, this is a really interesting game because we see the character of Cid take a really interesting turn. And while he maintains the wizened genius and engineer trait, and he invents airships in this game, he adopts a much more sociopathic persona and aspects of personality that actually remind me of Hojo from Final Fantasy VII. Like Hojo assisting Shinra in becoming a superpower, so too does Cid's inventions help the Empire pursue their goals. His role as a secondary antagonist is doubly interesting because he's also Balthier's father, which plays into the core story and character arc of Balthier quite well, I think. Final Fantasy XII also sees us witness the character of Al-Cid, who, although rarely mentioned in Final Fantasy discourses, works in similar fashion to the core canonical Cid character. Which is to say, Al-Cid is very particular and recurring, but only within the Ivalice settings of the games. So he appears in Final Fantasy XII, Revenant Wings and Tactics A2 as a recurring secondary hero and ladies' man. So in Final Fantasy XIII, and very similar to how Cid in Final Fantasy XII is aligned with the immortal Okuria Venat, Cid in XIII is also, at least officially, in servitude of immortal beings, and he's the commander of the Cavalry Airship Brigade of Cocoon. So 13 actually sees Cid's character depart somewhat from his popular depictions because he's much more younger and beautified in his aesthetics, and he's generally more of a friendly guy than we've previously seen him as well, which is a break from the norm. And moving finally on to Final Fantasy XV, early snapshots of the game saw many thinking that Cindy was this game's rendition of the Cid character, particularly some Kotaku articles that I read, which made somewhat of a big deal out of it. However, Cindy was perhaps merely promotional eye candy intended to garner conversation and controversy about the game, because of course, as we've discovered having played it, it's all about her grumpy grandfather, Cid, who resumes the tradition of being a grumpy old guy and an engineering genius. However, despite this, I would argue that Cindy and Cid do share the role and responsibilities of this stereotypical character, because as the elder Cid tends to focus on synthesis and weapon upgrades, Cindy is usually the character that, as a mechanic genius, fixes up and modifies the regalia for us, which, of course, is this link to the mode of transport which our characters use. So, there we have it, a very brief overview, and I've probably said Cid about 200 times during this episode, but I do think he's a very interesting character to consider when we look at the lore and the history of the Final Fantasy series. You know, he's ever evolving, but consistently the same. And as I posited earlier, I believe he's this avatar of technology and transition that each game, to a lesser or larger degree, tends to hinge around. So, what do you think? Drop a comment and start a conversation on your thoughts of Cid. And if you like what I'm saying, as always, I appreciate a share and also appreciate a subscribe, which will keep you updated on my latest episodes.